Right. Well, absolutely. Yeah. Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I know. Boy, if only I had done this before. Yeah, I've done a few of these. Yeah, it's a huge difference. The thing is, I recently bought a copy of the journal. I stopped subscribing to it. I don't normally buy it. I picked it up because my daughter was actually mentioned in the paper, so I picked up a copy of it. And it was like a newsletter. Just the sheer size of the paper. Back in the day, it was like a doorstop. Now it's like a newsletter. It is so small and flimsy. And that it's almost like a symbolic, it's almost a symbolic appearance of a newspaper in terms of it is so small and flimsy, just like the political coverage in many ways, because there's so few reporters now. There are so few editors. There's so few people at the Edmonton Journal, of course, and that's reflected in the actual product. So that product reflects basically the reality of journalism in terms of just the size and the heft and how it feels. There is no heft to it at all. Also, the fact that a lot of the coverage, the coverage in the Herald, Calgary Herald, Edmonton Journal, Calgary Sun, Edmonton Sun, it's all the same now. Those four newspapers are all part of the Post Media chain. Back in the day, when I was at the legislature, of CBC Television and then the Edmonton Journal, there was almost 10 or 12 people, from the Sun, Edmonton and Calgary, the Herald and the Edmonton Journal had a total of about maybe 10 to 12 people at the legislature. Now there's one person there full time and second person backs up. The people there are really good reporters, but the fact there's so few of them now is it's reflected in the actual coverage of the paper. Also, the fact that the editorial content of the journal is very right-wing, very conservative. And that's a big change from what it used to be. Because again, it's Post Media editorial content in all the platforms in Alberta, from Post Media, all the four main newspapers. It's all the same. And back in the day, the journal was noted for being a bit different from the Herald, different from especially the Sun's. It was seen as being much more progressive than the other outlets. And that was unique to Edmonton. And the thing is, Edmonton to this day is still more progressive. The paper doesn't reflect that. The city of Edmonton, of course, provincially voted all NDP. Federally, of course, most of it's Conservatives. There's a couple of the Liberal and a New Democrat. But provincially, the city went all NDP, but the paper doesn't reflect that. And we've seen in the past few elections where we knew the city was going to go, in 2015, we knew it was going to go NDP, absolutely. But the Journal was told by Post Media headquarters to write an editorial supporting the Conservatives. Here's reasons to vote for, at the time, Jim Prentice and the Conservatives. And when we knew the public, that turned off the public big time. When your paper is supposed to reflect the society that you're covering, like not slavishly, but reflect the reality on the ground. What are people in Edmonton talking about? What are they thinking? And you reflect that back to them. Well, the Journal stopped doing that. Editorially, it was moving to the right. I left in 2018. I could see where it was going. And that's continued even more. And there's so few voices now, provincially, when it comes to politics, talking about opinion columnists. They're all conservatives to one degree or another. So the paper, where it's going to go, at this point, it's going to disappear into nothing. I mean, like literally, because it's gone from this really hefty newspaper in all respects in terms of the size of it, plus the content, journalistically very hefty, to this lightweight newsletter, as I call it. And the problem is, if it continues this way, with the way the media is going, it'll disappear online. It'll go online as opposed to being an actual newspaper, and that undercuts everything as well. Fewer people, fewer resources. They can't cover stories like they used to. Back in the day, we had beat reporters. We had people actually covering different beats, education, environment, things like that. That doesn't happen anymore. There's so few people, and there's some really good reporters, but there's so few of them now covering politics that the journal, it's a cliche to say it's a shadow of its former self, but it is a shadow. Yeah, it's a complicated question, isn't it? Well, first of all, the media in Alberta has tended to be conservative. Again, the Edmonton Journal was kind of the odd person out, the odd newspaper out. So why did it become the way? Yeah, you could say the thing is, we used to be part of Southern and then Can West. And then with all the it was sold and bought and sold and bought, and hedge funds, and they get smaller and smaller, it shrinks further and further. It becomes part of a chain. It gets subsumed by a chain. You could argue back in the day, even though it was part of the Southern chain, well, back in the day it was actually an independent newspaper, but then it became part of the Can West chain. Even then, when I joined it in 1995, a lot of independence. And this was, look, back in the day, the Journal, I was traveling the world, like literally. I went to Russia. I went to all over North America and the U.S. and to Mexico because we had the money back then, but also we were really independent in a lot of ways. Then you had Conrad Black came along, of course, National Post. He began to centralize things to save money, so the foreign corresponding, the actual real investigative work was actually being done by the National Post. It began shrinking what was happening in the regions, and Edmonton felt that as well. It got smaller and smaller, of course. Then, of course, Post Media began really downsizing. You mentioned the hedge funds. Yeah, it's all about money, squeezing. And that, when it comes to Post Media being to me, a very conservative leaning brand, it began to affect the Edmonton Journal. You got fewer and fewer people. And what was happening was even the local independents, when you had like a publisher, managing editor, living in Edmonton, being part of the Edmonton community, that also helped the independents. But then we began shrinking, end up having a publisher or the managing editors in Calgary. I forget the actual steps, but it began moving away from Edmonton more to a centralized location where the headquarters was determining the editorial content for the whole chain. And that affected Edmonton as much as, well, I would say in a sense more so than many other newspapers in the chain, based on my experience, that the editorial content was dictated by people who did not live in Edmonton, by people who didn't really so much care about journalistic integrity, or as I say, the heft of what was in the actual newspaper. It moved away and became the sort of headquarters dictating everything, saving money, fewer resources, fewer reporters. And your reporters now running around, of course, trying to cover everything, and they just can't do it. But also it meant that more progressive voices, either, in my case, I took a buyout, I left. And so I think that you'll see, sorry, losing my headphone here, you're seeing this shrinking of credibility and shrinking of coverage. And they kind of go hand in hand when you have the people in charge making decisions, not living in Edmonton, not really caring about the community, and just it's a matter of saving money and cutting back. So now the voices, the editorial voices, that usually are very conservative. And that, to me, is sort of a progression. It's hand in hand with being bought by hedge fund operators, as well as the removal of people, like physically people from the newsroom. And the thing is, right now, like speaking of being removed physically from the newsroom, there's nobody in the newsroom. They're all working from home now. There's very disparate voices. So the newsroom, I've been told, I haven't been to the Journal in like 5 years. Because of the pandemic, people moved reporting from home and then actually staying at home and then talking to the bosses by phone or by Zoom. So that's, I think, also played into the fact that the cohesive voices in the newsroom could get together and discuss issues isn't there anymore. It's just a case of churning things out and beholden to a more conservative presence online, a more conservative voice from Post Media. Right. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, it's a matter of saving money as well, right? So it's more, I guess, economical, not more, it's not better for journalism to have somebody in a head office somewhere, whether it's Toronto, Ottawa, Winnipeg, whatever, making decisions that affect newspapers as opposed to having people on the ground in Edmonton like we used to have that can actually look at issues happening locally. And local journalism has shrunk tremendously over the years. And again, I'm thinking back to when I joined a journal in 1995. I was not just covering events in Alberta. I was sent to see how these events were being played or how they're affecting or how we're being affected by outside influences across Canada and the US and the world. So even though I might be going to other places in North America, it's all about how does this influence what's happening in Alberta. I can't think of examples right now. Give you good. Well, yeah, I guess I do. But people like one case, an Albertan student was killed, ended up dead in Tijuana. This is going back to 1998, roughly. So I went to Tijuana for weeks and weeks to investigate what happened to that kid, university student, in Tijuana. So they sent me down there. Even though I was in Tijuana, I was reporting on an Albertan, what happened to that Albertan in a foreign country. So, of course, that's gone out the window now, and that's a case of there's no money for doing things like that. And because we are losing this regional voice, we're losing this idea of local journalism. It's not because people don't want local journalism. I think it's because there isn't the money to cover really local journalism, especially in newspapers. And when I say cover local journalism, I don't just mean covering local events like a traffic accident. I'm talking about digging into things, looking at what's actually happening with government policy. And we did a lot of that back in the day, looking at things, how government policies affected life in Alberta. And Edmonton, of course, with the Edmonton Journal, the Herald was doing things like that, more investigative work, telling people what's actually happening with government policy. It wasn't just a case of government releasing something and then a reporter, what happens too often now, reporter goes down, they cover that release, they get the opposition, and then that's it. And I'm not criticizing reporters. It's just the case they're on the treadmill trying to cover so many things. Back in the day, we could actually dig into things, look at this. You can call it local journalism, but it's really important. So very often you think local journalism is, sort of second-rate journalism in the sense that the national, international thing is where it's at. No, local journalism for the Edmonton Journal was really important. The paper won all kinds of awards for what it was doing, but that's not happening anymore because of this centralized authority, if you can call it that, in journalism where the head office, to save money and make things easier, to make more profits, is dictating from the central office what is happening around the country. I'm talking about the editorial content. Yes, sure, reporters are still going to go out and cover City Hall and things like that, but it's not the same depth. It's not the same coverage that we used to have, again, back in the good old days when we had beat reporters. So you had people covering legislature, but also people covering issues like education, labor, environment, and they would work with the people covering the legislature to cover things in depth. So we're losing that. And when I talk about print, print has a huge influence, at least it used to. It still does to some extent over other media like radio and television. I've worked in all three. And I can tell you, again, back in the day, when you had a really robust local newspaper like the Edmonton Journal, the TV people would come in the morning reading all the stories, and there'd be stories laid out in a sense. Because TV, getting a story done properly in television, of course, back in the day before Zoom and things like this, it was really labor intensive. You got to go out and interview people, get pictures, get video of what's actually happening in a certain story. So if you come in, and it's very difficult to start from scratch in television, to go from an idea and get it done. If you come in the morning and there's some really good journalism in the Edmonton Journal, and most days there was, I'd say almost every day, there was something we could follow in television. So front page story, we could actually say this is a story, and then we could follow it, try and improve on it, or maybe sometimes we think that we can go a different way with that story, but very often what was driving the news focus in other media and radio and television was the morning's newspaper. And I would say we've lost that. And I can't speak to TV right now, but I know that they're under the pressure as well. But the content of local papers for so long was driving good journalism, driving more good journalism. And we're not seeing that anymore. It's more a case of just covering things and the low-hanging fruit. An example, here I go off on a tangent here. Auditor General reports. The auditors, the auditors general across the country, really important reports. Same in Alberta. But the thing is, there's a lot of issues in there that need time to actually dig into. And too often now what's happening is reporters under stress go in, pick the low-hanging fruit and what the reports are saying, and then do a quick story and then they're gone. Whereas back in the day, print had the people and the time and the expertise to dig into some of these issues, report on them, and then other media that didn't have the time or resources like television and radio could actually then follow some of the investigative work done by print. So I'm a bit off a tangent here from your question about centralization, but I think that what's happening now in journalism, there's so few people covering it, it becomes, again, as a cliche, this self-fulfilling prophecy. Media is dying, people don't read it because the content isn't there. The interesting items aren't there. Digging into issues and presenting them in a readable way is not there. So people are reading, watching, I'd argue maybe less, especially local journalism, because the product isn't what it used to be. And the thing is, though, quickly, that doesn't mean people are not interested in politics or what's actually happening in society. You get news agencies or news outlets like the New York Times. Good readership. People are actually reading that. It's good journalism because there's money being put into that. People are willing to pay for that. The problem is journalistically, locally, who wants to buy the local paper if it's not really giving you something worth buying? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yes, you're right. And of course, happening right now, of course, with Bill shutting down or selling, rather, some local radio stations. Yeah, and no, that award, of course, the Bronze Award is still in the lobby, I believe, of the Edmonton Journal. And you're right, the other 40 got, I guess, printed certificates for the award. And the thing is, it was an award plus a reward to local papers saying, yes, we see you. They put into the parlance of today. We see you. We hear you. You've done a great job on this. And that was an indication that not the world, not just the Pulitzer Committee, but the world was watching what was happening in Alberta and saying to newspapers, even though the government, of course, the Socrats actually won that election in 1935, we still value what you were trying to do and standing up for freedom of the press. Yet democracy, it's a real problem. I see it, of course, firsthand in Alberta, where there's fewer reporters covering events, covering government, covering policies, covering how politicians affect our lives. And that is a major problem, especially in small towns. Like, who's going to be covering the local town council meeting? When things there are discussed that affect people's lives, if there's no one there to cover that, what does that mean? Does that mean, I would say it means that politicians may be getting away with things they shouldn't be getting away with, that no one's actually watching over their shoulder. Because thing is, when a reporter goes to a city council or a town council meeting, they're the eyes and ears of the public. They're there to tell people this is what's happening and to boil it down and to actually put things in context. But if that's not there, then what happens? It's like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, or if a story breaks at town council and no one is there to write about it, who will learn about it? And it does absolutely affect, I would say, democracy, but also you have bad players in politics who want that to happen, who do not want someone there watching what they are doing. And in the past, we saw governments, like Klein, for example, would try and push things through, but if you had a lot of reporters there pushing back, you could see what was happening. A huge example was when Klein was looking at using the notwithstanding clause to limit the ability of the sterilized Albertans, who were sterilized under the Socrat government, to limit their ability to actually sue the government for compensation. Now, the opposition was all over that, but the media really dug into that to explain to people what's going on, and not just swallow the government's point of view, to actually present other voices. So if a person, a reporter, journalist, goes to question period or town council meeting, local government, civic government, and actually then gets a story out giving other points of view, then that helps put things in context for the public to help them make a decision. Is this something good? This is something that the public should support. And I think that is missing when local papers shut down, when local media shuts down, then a very important voice is shut down. And it's a voice, it's a reflection of what's happening in the town back to the people. If they don't know what's happening, then all kinds of mischief can be done by politicians. Yeah. Oh, it was a huge landmark case for the media. But also it reflected to the public, look, the media is really important. It's doing its job here. Of course, the thing is, Eberhard, of course, hated the media. A lot of the media were against Eberhard, trying to point out the flaws of the social credit. The free money just wasn't a free money real thing. So the social credit idea was based on a very flimsy pretense. But the media pointed that out. Of course, the public still voted for a social credit. But the fact that the media was there to point these things out, it's been after the fact proven to be true. What they were doing is telling the truth. There was some partisan issues behind the newspapers as well. I admit that. Of course, that's not gone away. That's sort of an issue that still plagues us today. But I think it was a huge issue for the local media because the world was watching what was happening in Alberta. And of course, this was the rise of fascism in Europe. I think that some media called Eberhard sort of a little Hitler, which I think, is very apt, what was happening. So I think that was really important. And it's an issue that, of course, the journals for years, for decades, it was a badge of honor, a huge badge of honor, as I say, in the new journal building. It was built, I guess, like 30 years ago or more. The lobby has that bronze plaque. That Pulitzer Award is there for all to see, and the paper was really, really proud of that. Right now, the building, as far as I know, is just empty. It's been emptied out over the years in terms of shutting down newspapers as fewer and fewer people, saving money. The building, basically, I've been told, is empty. So you have this sort of award sitting in an empty building. At one time, it was full of reporters and people coming and going, and the public could actually see it. And and now the building is empty. So you have this really important award sitting there and nobody to see it. I think that's really powerful. It's a symbol. It's very powerful. There's no one there to actually look at the award anymore. Now, it's interesting. The public doesn't really remember this. And in fact, what's happened over the years is politicians in Alberta have actually skewed what happened. Because the Accurate News and Information Act was only one part of an act, or one part of a movement by the government of Eberhard. The other parts were doing with trying to set up, in a sense, their own banking system in Alberta. And that was deemed to be basically unconstitutional. But what's happened here is politicians like Ted Morton, for example, who is a former cabinet minister. He's a professor at the University of Calgary. He ran for the leadership of the PCs, Conservatives here in Alberta, in 2006. He did not win. But he has written, even recently, about how the Alberta government has pushed back against the federal Liberals, the federal government. And examples he points to are what the Social Credit did in 1937 with these various acts dealing with banking, but also wrapped into that is the Accurate News and Information Act. So he is pointing to what Eberhard did in the 1930s as a good example of how provincial governments stand up to the federal government. And he is glossing over the fact that the Eberhard government was trying to massively interfere with freedom of the press. So this is something that not only has what happened in the 1930s been forgotten in many ways, you have politicians today twisting things around, making it a good thing. Now, I talked to Morton about this back in 2006, and I said, why do you, and he's done it since, why do you lionize Eberhard for what he did in the 1930s? He tried to interfere in freedom of the press, and Morton goes, I forgot about that aspect. I forgot about that. But yeah, you shouldn't be forgetting about that, because again, it's all lumped together. What Eberhard did on economic issues was also tied into what he was trying to do with freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And politicians today and the public have forgotten about that, and at times they are misusing what happened back then to glorify what Eberhard did with standing up for provincial rights and provincial jurisdiction, when in fact what they were doing was trying to undermine democracy by undermining freedom of the press. Yeah. Yeah, this goes back to my point about having somebody on the ground in the newspaper who lives in the community is actually overseeing what's actually happening with the Edmonton Journal as an independent institution, if I can call it that. And of course, that's not just something that happened back in the 30s. I saw it when I was joining the Journal in the 1990s into the 2000s. We have editors who were dealing with Edmonton Journal issues, the Edmonton Journal local coverage, and it is so important. And of course, back in the 1930s, you had a big newsroom, and of course, Edmonton being the capital of Alberta, dealing firsthand with the government, just down the street, basically, from the headquarters of the Journal was the legislature. So there was a real, more tactile, if I can call it that, sense of actually being there, present every day, covering the government. Edmonton's the capital. Edmonton Journal was the major paper in the paper covering the government at the time. So you had somebody, an editor, dealing with these issues for a local paper, covering provincial matters that were really, really important for the public, and yet somebody there saying, we're going to deal with this, we're going to take this on, and having courage. and having support to do that. So this was the Edmonton Journal making a decision to do that, independent of any sort of head office back in Toronto or Winnipeg or whatever. They weren't dictating what was going on. The Journal was independent, and we've lost that sense of local community papers doing what's best for the local community. And yeah, it did lead the way. So you had other newspapers across Alberta. Back in the day, some of those small papers, like the Medicine Hat newspaper, had a reporter at the legislature as well. So you had other voices from local papers actually in the legislatures. Alberta had many papers, a lot more, of course, than they do right now, but you also had people from those local papers covering Alberta politics full time. And the Journal was the main player. It was right in the capital, had more people, but still. So it wasn't just the Edmonton Journal doing it alone. You had other voices reflecting the very same opinion based on facts, based on intimate knowledge of what the Eberhardt government was doing. So that is so important. And I saw that at the Journal when I first joined in the 1990s, and that was really important to how we covered the legislature. Now, at times, it irritated the government. I remember, I wasn't around for this, but I guess when Lougheed won a huge majority, I guess almost every seat in the legislature, the publisher of the Edmonton Journal said, we will now become the unofficial official opposition. And that rankled conservatives for decades after the fact. When Klein was premier, he'd bid speeches talking about how the Edmonton Journal is still the voice of the opposition. How dare they be so partisan? Conservatives are very thin-skinned. They could have every paper every newspaper in the province on their side. You have one voice speak out against the government, and they take that to heart, and they get really irritated. I saw it firsthand myself, how the Journal, a lot of media commentators in Alberta are more conservative. Edmonton Journal had more progressive voices, and I saw how people would attack me for having, this is outside of Edmonton, people attacking me for having an opinion they did not like. But you had courage and support from the editor and people behind the scenes at the newspaper who were encouraging voices that were opposed to bad government policy. And we're not seeing that today for many reasons, not only a political bent by, for example, Post-Media, but also the fact there's so few people covering legislature to dig into things we saw back in the 30s that were so important. You had a courageous newspaper, courageous editors leading the way that not only determined what was happening in the Edmonton Journal, but also would affect and support what other papers were doing in the province. Yeah, well, huge, of course. Disinformation, misinformation is a gigantic problem. People are put into silos. Back in the day when someone had a conspiracy theory, they could yell at the television from their basement. But now they have the ability online to join with a community online who believe in the same conspiracies. So that is poisoning what is a fact anymore. And this is a problem for media. So there is a real problem with this basic, what is a fact? And get conspiracy theories out there that are online, that can spread disinformation. And you're seeing a weight given to these voices that influences other people's opinions. And this is a real problem. You got artificial intelligence as well is a major, major problem, because you had some of these voices in the past that couldn't put two words together can now ask AI to generate a conspiracy theory, and they can put it out there, and people who are prone to believe this, anecdotal evidence and confirmation bias, will eat it up. And so what all of a sudden, the so-called mainstream media gets attacked for having fake news. Of course, Donald Trump, even though our premier right now, Danielle Smith, plays into that. Mainstream media is not the only voice I listen to when she's talking to people, I wouldn't call them news agencies, other outlets online that spread disinformation, misinformation, and she plays into that crowd. And Kenny did the same thing. The problem is they cultivate those kind of people, and then that begins to influence policy. We're seeing that right now, without getting into all the weeds, but right now we're seeing, of course, the trans policies, the gender issues policies coming from the government, at least the idea they're going to bring in policies starting in the fall. This is being in many ways pushed by groups like Take Back Alberta that deal in misinformation, disinformation. But that gets people out to things like the UCP's annual general meeting last fall to push socially conservative issues that are in itself based on misinformation, but that influences how the government behaves in reaction. That influences government policy, and we're seeing that right now because we're seeing the Premier in Alberta promise to bring in some legislation or guidelines or changes in the fall dealing with gender issues in schools. And that, to me, is based on a very loud group of people online pushing an agenda, but also they turn up in public because they get together online and they help each other. They have a community online that then shows up publicly that then can distort what's happening in the public discourse. That's a roundabout way of saying online, it's hit newspapers, all the media has been hit by this because all of a sudden the money isn't there. The ad revenue is dried up. There's no money. So what's happening? Newsrooms are shutting down. They're laying off people. And that is this vicious cycle. What's the solution? I don't know what the solution is. I have written about this kind of thing in the past. And ultimately, what would help if people just simply paid, even for one subscription to something like the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, to a mainstream media, because they trust it. If people would just buy one subscription, that would help the media, the mainstream media. Of course, that's become sort of a pejorative term, right? Mainstream media, the legacy media. But if people actually paid to read things, good journalism, that would be a huge help. Another problem is media literacy. People often can't differentiate between what is real and what is fake. So I don't have any answers. I have no solutions to this. I deal with it every day, and I talk to reporters. Some got laid off just a few days ago. It's heartbreaking, but I don't know what the solution is if the public isn't behind good journalism, can't tell good journalism from bad journalism. This is going to be a problem that's going to send the media into a tailspin, and you're going to have more corporate ownership, more centralized decision-making when it comes to journalism, and that's going to be a major problem for democracy. I can't hear you. No problem. Yeah. 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 The thing is, to be honest, I'm not an expert on social credit because it's not something. I did a course on social credit in university a long time ago, and so I really can't talk about social credit that much compared to the government I've covered since the days of Don Getty. But you're right. Going back to the idea of controlling the media, yeah, that's the dream of governments, isn't it? Well, you see it now with Kenny. Was all about controlling the media. This is cherry-picking people that he will talk to. Same with Danielle Smith. Now, mind you, I got a year-end interview with her, But generally speaking, throughout the year, she tends to talk to select reporters, select columnists who get her message out with no pushback. It's basically them taking a news release, basically, and running with it as if this is exclusive. And this is the government controlling the media. And again, the public isn't up in arms about it, I would say. Well, some are, but a lot of them aren't, because there's no one reporting on the fact that the media is being co-opted by the government, if you follow me. So the government can co-opt the media, and very often the media is very willing, certain media that is, and certain voices, to be co-opted because under the guise of inside information, exclusive stories and columns. It's not. It's exclusive, yes, but that's not real journalism. They just tend to be co-opted, and they're given basically talking points to repeat to the public as if this is a breaking news. And we're seeing much more of that. We're also seeing it's easier for governments to bypass the mainstream media because of ability to go online and actually do things that are not funneled through the mainstream media. They don't want things to be funneled. They want to do their own funneling. They want to do their own ability to affect or shape the narrative. We saw that again last week when Danielle Smith had a news conference on the Thursday to announce her gender policies in schools, but she announced it really the day before on a very carefully orchestrated, carefully scripted, carefully presented YouTube video. It is a soft launch into what she was going to do in the announcement on the following day. So governments really, it's easier now for them to control the media because they can very often just bypass the media to get their message out. And I think that's something that's happening in, of course, media across the world. It's easier now for governments to control the message, get it out, and bypass the mainstream media. So again, is there an answer to that? I don't see anything easy. And AI, as I mentioned, you got some news agencies in the U.S. trying to get the government to pass a law that when companies using AI just can't scrape all the news content from reliable media like the New York Times, whatever, and then present that as something unique. There is so much going on right now. It's a confluence of events, and it's been driven by things online, the internet. I'm not, of course, unique in saying this, but is there a solution? I don't see a solution to this.